The wind on the prairie never stopped. It wasn't just weather, it was a voice, low, constant, and mournful, whispering through the tall, dry grass, rattling the loose boards on the old ranch house. Some might say it was lonely, but for Thomas Calloway, it was familiar, almost comforting in its consistency. For 5 long years, that wind had been his only companion since Sarah died, and in those 5 years, not much else had spoken. Thomas lived alone, tucked away in a small, weather-beaten ranch that sat like a forgotten punctuation mark in the vast open sentence of the high plains. The nearest town was 2 days' ride, but he hadn't been there in months, maybe years. He didn't keep track. Out there, time wasn't measured in hours or calendars. It was measured in seasons, in the way the cattle moved, in the way the snow crept in or the sun cracked the ground. They say grief softens with time, that pain fades like footprints in dust. But Thomas knew better. For him, grief was like the dust itself, fine, invasive, settling on every part of life until it dulled everything else. He didn't feel time pass, he just moved through it. Feed the cattle, mend the fence, cook a quiet meal over a low fire, sleep, wake, repeat. Have you ever lived through a stretch of time where every day felt the same, where survival was the only thing that made sense? People in town, on the rare occasion he passed through, looked at him with either pity or suspicion. He couldn't stand either. So he stayed away, avoided conversation, avoided connection. The land, with all its harsh indifference, suited him better. It didn't ask questions, it didn't offer condolences, it just was. Brutal, raw, unforgiving. In a strange way, it mirrored the state of his own soul. He was only 35, but you wouldn't know it by looking at him. His face was worn, lined by sun and sorrow. His hands, thick with calluses, remembered the weight of rope and steel better than the feel of another's touch. His eyes were always scanning the horizon, not for people, but for signs of weather, predators, trouble. He had built a life where no one could get close, not just to avoid the world, but to avoid the risk of ever feeling that kind of pain again. That cabin was both his sanctuary and his prison. The walls kept the world out, but they also locked his memories in. Memories of laughter that used to echo through that space. The sound of Sarah's voice, the warmth of her hands, the way she used to braid wildflowers into her hair and laugh at his terrible singing. All of it now just dust in the corners. Summers were merciless, with sun that baked the earth until it cracked into veins of parched despair. Winters came in like a fist, cold enough to kill a man in his own bed if he wasn't prepared. Coyotes howled like lost spirits. Rattlesnakes curled under the sparse shade, and the wind, always the wind, never let you forget you were small out there. But Thomas endured. He didn't live. He survived. Sometimes when he rode the fence lines, checking for breaks or signs of trespass, he'd look out at the distant horizon and wonder if there was still a version of him buried somewhere beneath the dust and solitude. A version who laughed, who danced with his wife in the rain once, barefoot and drunk on love. But those memories had faded like sun-bleached photographs, too fragile to hold on to. This was his world now. Stark, silent, relentlessly honest. And then, one evening, as the sun sank low and spilled orange across the prairie, something changed. But that part comes next.
It was late afternoon when the sky began to turn. You know the kind of light I'm talking about? That eerie, heavy glow that settles over the land just before a storm rolls in? The sun bleeding orange and purple across the horizon, shadows stretching long like ghosts rising from the ground. Thomas Calloway was out riding the southern fence line, reins loose in one hand, the other resting on the worn leather of his saddle. The wind had picked up, sharp with the scent of dust and coming rain. Out there he could smell a storm before he could see it. He wasn't looking for anything, just doing what needed to be done. Another circuit, another day like any other. But then he saw something. Movement. Just off the trail near a patch of dry brush. At first he thought it was a calf, strayed from the herd maybe, but his gut told him different. As he drew closer, the shape took form. Small. Human. Still. His stomach tightened. He dismounted slowly, boots hitting the earth with a quiet thud. Rifle in hand, not out of aggression but caution, he scanned the land around him. No one. Just wind and silence. The figure wasn't moving. He stepped closer. It was a young woman. She was curled in on herself, as if trying to disappear. Her clothes were torn, streaked with dirt and blood. One arm lay at an unnatural angle. Her face, partially hidden beneath tangled dark hair, was marked, etched with an intricate pattern of old scars that ran from her temple down her cheek. They were not accidental. They looked deliberate, ritualistic, unmistakably Apache. Thomas had seen scars like that before. Stories clung to markings like those. Some called them warnings, others said they were omens. But whatever they meant, one thing was clear. She was in trouble. He approached slowly, speaking gently, his voice barely louder than the wind. "Hey, you all right?" Her eyes flew open, dark, wide, wild with pain and fear. She flinched, tried to crawl back, her broken body jerking in protest. A crude knife glinted in her uninjured hand. She raised it, weakly, a futile attempt at defense. Thomas didn't move, just raised his hands, palms open. "Easy," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're hurt." She didn't understand his words, that much was obvious. But she understood posture, tone, the absence of threat. Still, her gaze flicked between him and the empty plains behind him, searching for danger, or maybe escape. Her lips were cracked. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. Thomas had seen this before, in cattle after a long drive, in men too long without water. She was on the edge. Heat stroke, infection, dehydration, pick one. The storm wasn't hours away. It was minutes. And leaving her there, that wasn't a choice. Not for any man with a soul still left in him. How many of us would stop in the middle of our own pain to help someone else we didn't know? Would you? "I need to help you," he said again, slower this time. He pointed to her broken arm, then gestured toward the distant shape of his ranch. "Shelter. Medicine." She hesitated. He pointed to her knife, waited. After a moment that felt too long, she let it fall to the dirt. Thomas exhaled. "All right," he said gently. "This is going to hurt." He moved with the caution of someone approaching a wounded animal, not out of fear, but out of respect. She tensed the moment he touched her, her body locked in pain and fear. But she didn't resist, didn't cry out, just endured, like someone had been through worse. She was light, lighter than she looked. He cradled her against his chest as he mounted the horse, keeping her injured arm steady as best he could. The rain had started, fat, heavy drops slapping the dry earth, turning dust to mud. The wind howled around him, but he didn't stop. He just kept riding, his arms tightening as she shivered against him. The ride back felt like a lifetime. But eventually, the little cabin came into view. He fumbled with the latch, kicked the door open, carried her inside. It was dark, spare, cold. A cot, a table, some shelves with supplies, nothing much. But it was safe. He laid her down by the fire, built the flames high until warmth filled the room. She lay still, eyes darting, uncertain, watchful. He brought water. She drank slowly. He cleaned the dirt from her face, saw the full extent of the scarring, and didn't flinch, just nodded as if to say, "I see you." Then he set her arm. It wasn't easy. She didn't scream, but her breath came sharp and broken as he worked. Splints, rags, wood from the fence post pile. He did it all like second nature, not because he was a doctor, but because out here, if you didn't know how to patch what was broken, it stayed broken. When it was done, she lay back, spent. Her eyes found his. Not trusting, not yet. But something had shifted. A flicker. A beginning. He handed her a canteen and some jerky. She took them. Ate slowly, never looking away. And in that moment, Two strangers, storm outside, silence between. They weren't so far apart. He didn't know who she was, didn't know what brought her here, what scars she carried deeper than the ones on her face, but he knew one thing. Tonight she wasn't alone, and neither was he.
In the days that followed, the storm passed, the wind softened, the skies cleared, leaving behind a crisp stillness that made the world feel both fresh and fragile. Inside that little cabin on the edge of nowhere, something quiet was beginning to shift. Her name, he learned, was Nahili. She said it softly, like she wasn't sure she had the right to claim it anymore. Nahili spoke little, a few broken English words, gestures, the occasional whisper in her native Apache. Her voice was cautious, like someone afraid that too much sound might crack whatever fragile piece had been offered to her. She watched Thomas constantly, not with suspicion, but with the alert, guarded attention of someone who had learned the hard way that safety is temporary. And Thomas, he moved around her like a man stepping through sacred ground. Careful, intentional. He let her see his hands before every movement. He spoke gently, explained what he was doing even if she couldn't understand the words. He didn't press, didn't ask who she was or what had happened. Not yet. He knew what it felt like to be made of wounds. He brought her water, food, kept the fire going, checked the splint on her arm and the gash on her leg. She never thanked him, not at first, but she didn't have to. He saw it in the way her shoulders softened slightly when he entered the room, in the way she no longer flinched when he stepped close. In a place that had been defined by silence and grief for so long, her presence was like a new language, one made of glances, of patience, of small acts of trust. By the third morning, she sat up on the cot without being prompted. A few days later, she stood, slowly, with effort, and began to fold the blankets she had used. Not out of obligation, but something else. A need, maybe, to not just be a guest, to participate in her own recovery. She swept the floor with a worn brush Thomas kept near the door. It wasn't much, but it was something. And that something grew. She started following him outside, moving cautiously but deliberately. She helped collect eggs from the hens, watching his motions and copying them. One morning she insisted, through a flurry of pointing and nods, that she could help him mend a section of the broken fence. Her arm was still stiff, but she held the wire taut while he drove the staples into the post. Side by side, in the dusty sun, neither of them said a word. They didn't have to. The silence had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't filled with grief or fear. Now it was something shared, something almost sacred. And for Thomas, that was disorienting. This woman, this scarred, near-silent survivor, was changing the shape of his world without ever meaning to. For 5 years, everything had been routine, survival. His days were predictable, his nights quiet, and his heart locked away like a room no one visited anymore. But now there were 2 plates on the table, 2 sets of footsteps on the cabin floor. Her quiet presence made him aware of how still his life had been. She didn't fill the silence with noise. She made the silence feel less alone. Isn't that what we all long for? Someone who doesn't try to fix us, but simply sits beside us in the quiet? She never smiled. Not yet. But there was a softness creeping into her eyes, a tension unwinding from her shoulders. It reminded him of the first green shoots after a long winter. Fragile, yes, but full of stubborn life. What surprised him most, though, was the way she looked at the land. Thomas had always seen the prairie as a test, a thing to endure. The sun, the cold, the wind, it was all survival. But Nahili looked at it like it was alive. When hawks circled overhead, she followed them with her eyes, murmuring something he didn't understand.
She touched the plants gently like greeting old friends. One afternoon, when she noticed him limping slightly from an old knee injury, she found a root near the edge of the pasture, ground it with a stone, mixed it into a paste, and wrapped it over the joint. The ache faded faster than it ever had with whiskey or rest. She knew the land in a way he never had. She belonged to it. And maybe for the first time in a long time, Thomas began to wonder if he could too, not as a man hiding from grief, but as someone connected to something living. He started teaching her English words, simple ones: sun, water, horse, fire, food. She repeated them carefully, her accent delicate but clear. In return, she taught him Apache, words for rain, for wind, for thank you. Their communication remained a patchwork of gestures and fragments. But somehow, it worked. Somehow, it was enough. Every shared sunrise brought a small piece of rhythm. Every meal eaten across from one another. Every quiet hour spent side by side, mending, cleaning, watching the fire. It all began to add up. Not into love, not yet, but into something that might lead there. Or maybe even something deeper. Understanding. Mutual existence. A life no longer lived in isolation. Nahili hadn't said much, but her presence had already said everything. Something was changing. And in the heart of a world so often harsh and empty, something rare was beginning to grow.
One evening, as the sky deepened into that kind of dusky blue that only happens after a storm has passed, Thomas sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle with slow, practiced hands. The soft rasp of metal against cloth was the only sound, save for the occasional crackle of wood burning in the hearth. Across the room, Nahili sat on the edge of the cot, legs tucked beneath her, her dark eyes fixed on the flames. Quiet, still, like always. But then she spoke. Her voice was soft, hesitant. The words came slowly, like stones being turned over for the first time in years. "Ran away," she said. Thomas looked up. She met his gaze, then looked away quickly. Her hand moved to her cheek, fingers brushing the jagged lines of the scar that traced down the side of her face. "They said, 'Bad sign,'" she whispered. "Sickness came. Many died. They said, 'My mark brought it.'" It took a moment for the meaning to settle in. The scars, so deliberate, so striking. They weren't a mark of tradition. They weren't tribal honor or identity. They were blame, condemnation. And her exile, it wasn't just banishment, it was abandonment. Her own people, gripped by fear and superstition, had decided she was the cause of their tragedy. A curse. Thomas sat back slowly, his hands lowering the rifle into his lap. For a long while, neither of them spoke. He looked at her then, really looked, not at the scars or the pain etched in her skin, but at the strength beneath it, the way she carried herself, the silence that didn't feel like weakness, but control, restraint. And in that moment, he didn't see an outcast. He saw a survivor. He nodded, just once. "I see." He didn't ask for more. She had already given enough. And maybe that offering, that small, brave sliver of her truth, opened a door inside him that had been locked for years. "My wife," he said, voice rougher than he expected. "Sarah. She died. Fever, back when the drought came through. 5 years now." He gestured toward the room, the fire, the empty walls. "Since then, just me." Nahili didn't move. She didn't offer sympathy or try to soften the weight of what he'd said. She just listened, really listened, with the kind of attention that doesn't come easy to most people. Her eyes stayed steady on his, holding space for the ache between the words.
and somehow that meant more than anything else could have. There's something strange about grief. People always say it fades with time, like it's some kind of passing illness. But for some of us, it doesn't go anywhere. It just settles in, like dust on the floorboards. Quiet, constant, always there, even when you think you've swept it all away. That night by the fire, the silence between them changed again. It wasn't the watchful stillness of strangers anymore. It was something else, something fragile and human. A thread, maybe. Not yet strong, but real. And in that silence, Thomas thought about all the times he'd sat in that very chair, watching the fire alone, feeling the space Sarah used to fill like a hollow echo. He thought about how he'd locked the world out after she was gone, not because he wanted to, but because it hurt too much to let anything else in. And he thought about how for the first time in years, someone was sitting across from him who understood, not just the idea of loss, but the raw, skin-deep reality of being left behind. Nahili didn't speak more that night, but as she lay down, her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than usual. And in that small glance, there was something unspoken, recognition, a mirror, the shared knowledge that pain, when seen and accepted, can become something else entirely. Maybe that's how healing starts, not with grand gestures or sudden hope, but with two people sitting quietly in a room, daring to say, "This is what broke me." Have you ever had someone listen to your pain, not to respond, but just to understand, and hearing in return, "You're not alone"? That moment didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the years they'd lost or the scars they carried, but it was enough to mark a turning point, a beginning. Because out there, in the vast loneliness of the prairie, where grief had become the only language either of them knew, they had finally found something else. A wordless, tentative connection. The kind of understanding that only comes when you've both walked through fire and survived.
The prairie had a way of making you forget the world beyond it. Out there, where the land stretched farther than memory and the wind whispered older truths, it was easy to believe you were alone. Safe, maybe. Free. But no place stays untouched forever. And peace, especially the kind built on something fragile, never lasts without being tested. It was a dry, dust-streaked afternoon when Thomas saw the riders. 4 of them, cutting across the distant plain like shadows with spurs. He knew the lead rider before he could make out his face. Brody. Tall in the saddle, mean in the eyes. A man who'd never needed a reason to hate, only an excuse. Thomas felt his gut tighten. He turned his horse hard, kicking it toward the cabin. Nahili was outside, near the chicken coop, scattering feed with her good arm, the sun catching in her dark hair. She saw him coming fast, saw the cloud of riders behind. Her posture stiffened, but she didn't run. She just looked at him, silent, steady, waiting. "Go inside," Thomas said quietly as he dismounted. "Lock the door." She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the men, then back to him. He saw the fear, yes, but beneath it, that same quiet strength that had carried her through exile, injury, and days of silence. Still, she nodded and disappeared inside, the door closing with a soft but final thud. Then he waited. Brody and his men reined in a few yards from the porch, kicking up a swirl of dirt and judgment. Thomas didn't move. He stood on the steps, rifle held low but ready, his boots rooted in a line he had already decided not to cross. Brody grinned, the kind of smile that didn't touch the eyes. "Well now, Calloway," he said, drawing the words out like he was savoring them, "heard you got yourself a visitor." Thomas kept his face still. "Just someone needed help." "Injured, huh?" one of the men spat, brown tobacco hitting the dirt like punctuation. "Heard it was an Apache." Thomas said nothing. Brody's smile widened, colder now. "You know what they say about folks with markings like hers? Bad sign. Could be cursed. Could bring trouble." Thomas felt something shift inside him. Not anger exactly, something deeper, colder.
a kind of bone-deep knowing that this wasn't just about Nahili anymore. It was about every wall he'd built, every mile he'd ridden alone, and the one choice he'd made that felt right for the first time in 5 years. "She ain't bringing trouble," Thomas said quietly. "She's under my roof. That makes her my responsibility." What does it take to stand up, not just for yourself, but for someone the world refuses to see? Brody's face darkened. The charm peeled back, revealing the threat underneath. "That ain't for you to decide," he snapped. "White man's land, Calloway. Don't matter if she's hurt, she don't belong. You know that." Thomas shifted his weight, the rifle steady in his hands. "You can ride back now," he said evenly. "Ain't nothing for you here." Brody leaned forward in the saddle, eyes narrowing. "You've gone soft," he said. "Town's talking, Calloway. You living out here with one of them. People don't like it. Might be they come up here themselves to see what you're hiding." He moved his horse a step forward. "I said ride on," Thomas said again, this time raising the barrel of the rifle just slightly. Not a threat, a line in the sand. Brody's men tensed, but none moved. They knew Thomas, knew he didn't bluff. "You're making a mistake," Brody said, voice low and bitter. "This ain't over. Town won't stand for it." "That's my problem," Thomas replied, "not yours." Brody stared at him for a long beat, the wind stirring dust between them. Then slowly, he reined back. "We'll be back," he said, "and there'll be more of us next time." Thomas didn't speak, just watched them turn and ride into the distance, their figures slowly swallowed by the heat and the horizon. When they were gone, he lowered the rifle, but his hands didn't stop shaking. He turned toward the cabin. The door creaked open just enough for Nahili to step out, eyes wide, her face pale beneath the fading scars. She had heard. All of it. And now she looked at him like she didn't quite believe what he had done, as if she couldn't reconcile the man who had walked in silence with the man who had just stood between her and danger. "Why?" she asked, softly. Her voice still carried that broken rhythm, but the question was clear. "Why you fight?" Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, the woman the world had cast out, at the strength behind the scars, and he thought about Sarah, about the years of silence, and how nothing had made sense until this. "Didn't feel right," he said. "Leaving you to them." He didn't say that seeing Brody's hate had stripped everything bare, that in that moment Nahili wasn't Apache, wasn't marked, wasn't a stranger. She was Nahili. Someone who had shown him more humanity than any townsperson in years. He didn't say that protecting her had felt like the first truly living thing he had done since burying his wife, but maybe he didn't need to. She stepped closer, her good hand reaching out, fingers grazing his sleeve, and for a moment, under the endless sky, nothing else mattered. Some moments changed everything, but they don't always arrive with thunder or fanfare. Sometimes they land softly, like a question whispered across the space between two people. "Why you fight?" Nahili's voice had been quiet, but the weight of it hung in the air like smoke. Thomas stood there, still holding the rifle he hadn't needed to fire, dust clinging to his boots, the wind beginning to settle after the confrontation with Brody. He looked at her, at the woman he'd risked his safety for, and answered the only way he knew how. "Didn't feel right. Leaving you to them." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. In that stripped-down moment, everything that mattered was already laid bare. What they'd faced wasn't just about one man protecting another, it was about choosing decency over silence, compassion over fear. And in the harsh, unyielding landscape, where both of them had learned how to survive alone, that choice meant something. In the days that followed, things didn't go back to how they were. They couldn't. Nahili stayed. Not because she had to, not because she was wounded anymore, but because, somehow, something had begun to grow between them. Not loudly, not in words, but in the rhythm of shared life. Her presence in Thomas's world no longer felt like an interruption. It felt like a completion. A corner of the map that had been blank for years was finally being filled in. They tended the land together, side by side. The work remained the same, but the meaning shifted. The garden behind the cabin grew under both their hands, rows of beans and corn slowly stretching toward the sky. She showed him things he'd never noticed, how to tell if a plant needed water just by the curl of its leaves, or how to soothe a fever with crushed wild mint. And he showed her the ropes of his world, how to patch tack leather, how to gauge the weather by the smell of the air, how to keep coyotes off the coop without wasting a single bullet. Language still came in fragments, but each day they taught each other more. Thomas learned the Apache word for sun, E, and woman, Azdan. Nahili practiced English, slow and careful. Fire, shelter, together. Neither of them was fluent in the other's tongue, but the silences between them no longer needed translation. And it wasn't just the words they shared, it was the time. The small everyday rituals that once belonged to solitude now held meaning. Folding blankets together after the night, drinking coffee on the porch as the first light touched the distant hills, fixing a broken hinge on the barn door while exchanging just a few tired smiles and nods. These weren't grand declarations. They weren't the stuff of stories told around fires. But they were real, and they were theirs. One morning while watching Nahili kneel by the garden rows, fingers in the earth, Thomas realized something unexpected. He hadn't thought of Sarah in days. Not with pain, anyway. Not with that sharp, cold ache in his chest. The memory of her was still there, always would be, but it had settled, like the snow settles quietly on the roof in the heart of winter, no longer crushing, just part of the landscape. He didn't feel guilty about that. Not anymore. Because Nahili hadn't replaced Sarah. She hadn't stepped into her shadow. She had simply brought her own light. And for a man who had lived for years in silence, that light was enough to begin again. Their bond was not fast or fiery. It was built in layers, slow as the prairie sun rising over dry hills. Trust, respect, familiarity, and beneath it all, the unspoken truth. They had both been cast out by a world too small to understand them. Now, somehow, they had found a way to fit in the spaces the world had left behind. One evening, Thomas came in late from the fence line. His hands were cracked from the cold, his shoulders heavy with dust and the weight of another long day. Nahili had already stoked the fire. A pot of beans simmered low. She looked up when he stepped in. No words, just a glance. And in that glance, the entire day was exchanged. Later, after dinner, they sat on the porch, listening to the wind as it moved across the grass. No longer hollow, but full of presence. Nahili leaned her head against his shoulder. Slowly, gently. Thomas didn't move. He rested his hand lightly on her arm. The gesture was small, but in it was everything they hadn't said aloud. The world outside hadn't changed. The threat still lingered just beyond the horizon in the shape of judgment and old hatred. But in the space between these two lives, something stronger had taken root. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but it was steady, and it was real.
In a world where noise often passes for meaning, where love is expected to be loud and passion to burn hot, there are some stories that unfold in near silence, slow, steady, and deeply human. This one is like that. A love not shouted from rooftops, but whispered between cracked walls and wind-blown fields. A love that began not with romance, but with mercy. Thomas and Nahili stayed, even after Brody's warning, after the stares and the talk from the town that drifted up the trails like dust from distant boots. They chose to remain together. They didn't run. They didn't explain themselves. They simply lived, side by side, in a world that never gave either of them much to begin with. And that choice, that quiet defiance, was more powerful than any fight. They knew they were being talked about. Rumors spread fast in small places.
Folks in town called Thomas strange, said he'd gone too long alone and taken up with a woman they didn't understand, didn't want to understand. They said her face carried a curse. They said no good would come of it. But Thomas had stopped living for their approval a long time ago, and Nahili, she had never been given the luxury of being liked. She had learned early that survival had nothing to do with what others thought of you, and everything to do with what you knew to be true. What they had wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. The land was still hard, and the work still relentless. Coyotes still prowled, rain still came late. But now the days had rhythm, and more importantly, they had meaning. Each morning started with the quiet clink of dishes, the brushing of boots by the door, the low hum of two people who no longer had to navigate the world entirely alone. Nahili's laugh, though rare, began to surface in the smallest moments, like when Thomas fumbled over an Apache word or tried to coax a stubborn chicken from under the porch. Thomas found himself smiling more, speaking more, remembering how it felt to be seen without explanation. They were no longer rescuer and rescued, no longer stranger and guest. They had become, slowly, naturally, family, not by blood, but by something deeper, a bond forged not in words, but in pain survived and peace chosen. They built a bigger garden that summer, added a second cot to the cabin, not because they needed distance, but because they were making room for each other, for the life they were shaping. Nahili painted the wooden shutters with symbols from her childhood, soft curves and sharp edges that meant protection, strength, home. Thomas taught her how to read the stars, something his father had taught him long ago. Sometimes at night, they'd sit on the porch, watching the prairie darken, stars bleeding into the sky one by one. And in those moments, with nothing but crickets and breeze between them, it was clear. This wasn't a temporary refuge. It was a beginning. Their love was never the kind that demanded attention. There were no grand declarations, no sudden kisses in the rain. Instead, it was in the way Nahili wrapped his lunch each morning, or the way Thomas covered the broken window with canvas before a storm hit so she wouldn't feel the cold. It was in gestures, in presence, in choosing to stay, again and again. Maybe love doesn't need to be loud to be real. Maybe it just needs to show up, over and over again. And there on a patch of unforgiving land, two people who had been abandoned by the world found a place they could belong. In time, the riders stopped coming. Brody never showed his face again. Maybe he figured they weren't worth the trouble. Maybe the town just got tired of caring. Or maybe they finally understood that no amount of hate could unmake what had been quietly and irrevocably built. Because what Thomas and Nahili had built wasn't just shelter. It wasn't even just a relationship. It was peace. A fragile but firm declaration that two broken people, if given the chance, could find healing not in escape, but in standing still long enough to grow roots. And in the end, it's not about whether the world approves. It's about whether we find someone who sees us, not in spite of our scars, but because of them. Someone who says, "You can rest now. I'll keep watch too." One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the sky into molten gold, Nahili leaned her head gently against Thomas's shoulder. No words, no movement, just that small gesture. And he didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He just rested his hand lightly over hers as if to say, "I'm still here. We're still here." The wind moved softly through the grass, no longer sounding like mourning, but like music. The prairie, once a place of exile, had become a sanctuary, not because the world had changed, but because they had. What if home isn't a place, but a person who stays?